Did you know Augustus made adultery a crime in 18 BCE, and a woman could lose her home overnight? People cheered, husbands feared informers, and even his daughter Julia got sent to Pandateria because he wanted Rome to watch. Today I will show what Roman authorities did to disgraced women, and why Rome called it morality. So let's find out. In 18 BCE, Augustus pushed the Lex Julia, and adultery stopped being family business and became a public crime. Ever wondered why that one change terrified women more than any rumor? Because it turned a private accusation into a legal machine with real penalties, island exile, property seizure, and a permanent stain. Under this law, a husband had a legal duty to prosecute, and if he refused, another citizen could step in and drag the case to court. That detail matters, because it created a system where outsiders gained power over a household's most intimate mess. Judges could order exile to an island, take part of a woman's property, and force divorce, all tied to one guilty verdict. Then came the social lock. Conviction could bar a woman from respectable remarriage, so even if she returned from exile, her future stayed boxed in. Roman jurists framed the goal as protecting family order, and Ulpian's line treated the woman as a danger to that order, which made harsh outcomes easier to defend. Here is the clause that still sounds unreal. Under strict conditions, a father who caught his daughter in the act in his own house could kill her and her lover on the spot. Ask yourself this: how many laws hand a parent that kind of switch, from witness to killer, with legal cover? Augustus proved the law applied even to his house. He sent his daughter Julia to Pandateria, and ancient writers said he was stricter than the law with her, because the disgrace felt personal. Rome got the message fast. One charge could tear up money, marriage, and life, and the city loved watching what came after. Romans built punishment around public viewing, and that design shows up all over: roadside crucifixions, chain displays, and crowds near the Forum. So when a woman got condemned, why would Rome keep it private? It often did the opposite, because humiliation worked better when neighbors watched. For disgraced women, authorities could rip away the markers of respect: a veil pulled off, clothing left torn, or the stola layers yanked aside. Romans treated a woman's sexual honor, her pudicitia, as a public asset, so shaming her body could be framed as protecting community morals. The body became the message, and the crowd learned how to read it. Some descriptions talk about women paraded or displayed with damaged clothing, so everyone saw the fall from respectable matron to a warning example. In some cases tied to damnation rituals, humiliation came first, and whatever penalty followed felt earned to the crowd, because the person already looked disgraced. Guards controlled the route, yet they rarely stepped in when bystanders pushed the line, as long as order stayed intact. There is also a clothing signal that later writers highlight: the toga muliebris, used as a marker that screamed public women. A moralist argued that prostitutes should be visually separated from honorable women. And once that idea takes root, forced exposure starts sounding like policy instead of cruelty. Here is the real effect. Men watching learned that the state backed their control over wives and daughters, and women watching learned that privacy existed only until Rome revoked it. If you think that ended at the courthouse, wait until you see how the street joined in, because the crowd never stayed quiet for long. Augustus encouraged citizens to report moral crimes, and that one push changed how neighbors behaved. Think about the incentive. Why protect a woman accused of adultery when reporting could look like loyalty? In tight Roman neighborhoods, fear moved faster than sympathy. Tenement blocks packed people into courtyards, and gossip traveled like smoke. Once a woman fell under accusation, silence became a survival strategy for everyone around her. Defend her too loudly, and you could look suspicious, especially in a culture that rewarded moral accusation. So, crowds formed, and when guards walked her through her own street, neighbors lined up to watch. Then, the public performance kicked in. Spitting, shouting, throwing refuse, calling her meretrix or worse, became a fast way to signal, "I stand with the moral order." Ancient moralists praised communities that shunned the disgraced, and one writer said shameless women deserved to lose the company of the decent. That sentence mattered because it turned cruelty into virtue. The hidden engine was fear. Friends who defended her risked sharing her stain through rumor, and for freed women and poorer citizens, one bad association could threaten fragile status, work, even housing. That risk pushed people to join the attack instead of resisting it. Law reinforced the social hit through infamia status, a dishonor category tied to people like prostitutes and pimps. Scholars link infamia to loss of credibility and loss of protections that respectable citizens expected, including protection from some corporal punishment. So the neighborhood learned a shortcut: treat her as unprotected and you likely face no consequences. Once that belief settles in, insults rarely stay verbal. The crowd started looking for a visible sign to keep the shame alive, and Rome had a simple one ready, because hair carried identity in public. Roman portraits show elite women with elaborate braids and coils, pinned with metal, because hair signaled status and modesty. So what happens when a woman becomes disgraced in a public way? Men often went straight for the scalp, because cutting hair worked like a label everyone could read. Ancient sources treat head shaving and rough cutting as serious humiliation, and later Christian writers describe shaving as punishment for sexual shame, especially adultery or prostitution. Scholars tracking Mediterranean punishment note the same meaning. A shorn female head could signal slavery and disgrace, stripping away femininity and rank in one glance. For a condemned woman, the cut could happen in public. Pins yanked out, braids ripped apart, hair hacked short, or even burned in places so it grew back jagged. One study described shaved hair as something that denied her identity, because it turned a person into a warning sign instead of a neighbor. Now think through the long-term effect. Hair grows back slowly, but rumor stays loud. That look changes how strangers treat her in baths, markets, and streets. And it also changes how guards treat her, because a woman who looks disgraced becomes easier to humiliate again. The state spends almost nothing, yet the punishment keeps repeating every time she steps outside. There is also a gender trap. Cropped hair on men could look normal, while a shaved head on women could mark them as sexually outside the rules. That mark invites staring, laughing, grabbing, and harsher treatment, especially when the crowd already believes she lost protection. Like, subscribe, and stay here. It gets worse in seconds. Once her hair carries shame, the next target becomes the clothing that marks respect. In Rome, cloth worked like a badge, and ripping it sends a signal you can feel in the crowd's mood right away. If you think that it stays staring, the next part turns physical fast. The stola garment mattered in Rome because it signaled modesty and rank at a glance. So when officials or soldiers ripped those layers, they did more than expose skin. They announced she no longer counted as respectable. That one signal can flip how a whole street behaves. Accounts of captured women after battles mention soldiers dragging them by clothing, stripping them in camps, and displaying them during triumphs. Historians of Roman warfare describe clothing theft as plunder and humiliation, and they connect it to sexual violence that often followed. Inside the city, tearing clothes sent the same message. Boundaries around her body had collapsed. Ask yourself why cloth carries so much power. Clothing told strangers what rules to follow, who to greet, who to avoid, and who to protect. Once a dress looked shredded, a woman could look like public property. Men who already wanted to push limits could claim the moment invited it, and guards often focused on keeping the route moving, so they chose convenience over protection. For enslaved and freed women, torn clothing carried another danger. It blurred the line between citizen and slave. That blur shaped how strangers felt allowed to touch, threaten, or demand. The result was a fast slide from street harassment into violence. This also explains why Rome tolerated the practice. It turned one person into a lesson with minimal effort. The crowd did the extra policing for free because the visual cue gave them permission. Each rip of fabric told bystanders, "Treat her differently now," and many accepted the invitation. Once that invitation exists, staring shifts into hands. Hands shift into shoves. Shoves shift into blows. And the worst part is that attackers could claim it was crowd reaction, not a crime. If you want to understand how fast that turns into public violence, look at how guards handled the next stage. Studies of Roman domestic violence describe women, slaves, and children as the ancient world's most vulnerable people, largely unprotected when stronger men chose force. During public shaming, that vulnerability got magnified because crowds treated punishment like entertainment. Sources describe condemned people slapped, kicked, and clubbed on the way to prison or execution, with soldiers guiding the route and crowds adding blows. On paper, magistrates controlled punishment. In practice, the street often blurred into the sentence, and guards rarely stopped it unless it threatened public order. Legal status shaped the risk. People pushed into dishonor categories could lose protections respectable citizens expected, so the crowd felt freer to act. That gap created a dangerous zone, where violence that would count as assault against a senator's wife could pass as reaction when the target carried a stain. Every hit carried a second danger, visible injury. A broken nose, missing teeth, and facial scars could change marriage chances, social standing, and basic survival. Early legal texts already priced injuries with visible scars more heavily because everyone could see the damage, and visible damage carried social meaning. Why would strangers join in? Group cruelty works like a loyalty shortcut. One person throws rotten food, another adds a shove, and others copy it to prove they stand with the moral order. Refusing to join could look like sympathy, and sympathy could look suspicious in a culture that rewarded informers. There is another detail that makes it worse. The first strike could come from someone who recognized her face. That personal hit turns punishment into social betrayal. By the time she reached a dock, prison, or exile route, her body could already be battered, and that damage often stayed off official records. Bruises can fade, though. Rome also used marks that stayed forever, written onto skin with hot metal. Once you see how those marks worked, you will understand why freedom later often meant almost nothing. Branding and tattooing show up in Roman punishment as a tool for slaves and some criminals, and the logic was simple: make the body readable. Runaways and thieves could receive stigmata letters on the forehead, and sources describe marks like fur for thieves. The goal was public identification before any explanation. For condemned people sent to harsh labor, Forced tattooing appears in descriptions linked to mines. That matters because it ties the mark to a pipeline, trial, to punishment, to transport. When a disgraced woman fell into slave status or hard labor, branding could turn her body into a moving legal record. Think about daily life under that. Buying bread becomes a negotiation with a scar. Entering a bathhouse becomes a risk. Even if a veil covers part of the face, burned skin can still show, and strangers can still decide what you deserve before you speak. The mark also changes how others behave. Employers can refuse work, buyers can demand lower prices, and neighbors can justify rough treatment. Even if someone freed her later, the mark argued against every second chance, because it warned people that helping her carried danger. Roman law framed branding as correction and deterrence, yet the effect felt like a life sentence. The state did not need to keep a person locked up when every stranger could enforce the label with mockery or violence. Here is the bigger connection. Once legal status drops far enough, the law starts treating harm as damage to property rather than harm to a person. That shift becomes crucial when you look at sexual violence, because Rome's rape logic depended heavily on whether the victim counted as someone's property. If that sounds brutal, it is. And the next section shows how the system made abuse easier to ignore. Roman law gave enslaved people no independent legal personhood, and that one rule changed everything about sexual safety. Owners could exploit slaves sexually without rape charges, because the harm counted as damage to property, not harm to a person. If another man assaulted someone else's slave, the owner could sue under the lex Aquilia, treating the assault like breaking someone's tool. Historians of Pompeii and Roman slavery describe female slaves living under constant risk of forced sex, pressured reproduction, and sexual use across the household. One modern scholar writes that many slaves could expect to be used sexually by their owners as a matter of course. That line matters because it describes routine, not exception. Now connect that to disgrace. A woman punished for a sexual crime could be pushed into slave status through sentencing or sale. Once that happened, consent stopped being a legal concern because the system centered ownership. Violence that would trigger outrage for a freeborn matron could become invisible procedure once she wore a slave mark. You might ask, why do some sources go quiet about details? Because elite writers often treated sexual access to slaves as ordinary. When something feels normal to the people writing, it shows up less, and that silence becomes its own clue about how accepted the abuse was. This also explains why sexual violence could function as punishment. Repeated coercion stripped agency, isolated victims, and made resistance feel pointless, especially when the law offered no path to justice. After a trial, a disgraced woman could be moved quickly into a market system built on ownership. Buyers already knew what they wanted, and she had little ability to slow the process. Once a person becomes merchandise, the courtroom stops mattering, and the price tag takes over. If you want to see how fast that swap happened in Rome, the auction block tells the story. Rome ran on a massive slave market fueled by war and punishment. Captives, debtors, and condemned offenders arrived in chains and got lined up for inspection. Studies of Roman captivity show that women taken in war faced sexual violence, forced labor, and sale as standard outcomes, not rare events. Once a disgraced woman fell into the slave category, officials could sell her to recover fines, settle debts, or move trouble out of sight.
Busy ports and markets rewarded speed. Inspection reduced a person to age, teeth, limbs, and perceived health, and the quicker the sale, the less chance she had to find help or stall the process. Later price lists show young women valued for beauty and fertility as much as strength. That detail tells you where many buyers expected profit, bedrooms, brothels, or household control. Ancient literature hints at the rest. Household slaves called to a master's bed, workers sent to brothels, entertainers forced into erotic performances. In every case, contracts between men decided the details, and her voice carried little weight. Notice how the pipeline works. A legal label becomes a commercial one. A courtroom decision can turn into a price tag within a day. Once sold, the law treats a runaway as property, and branding makes escape even harder. This is why some elite families tried to avoid public sale. They feared the long stain of disgrace and the loss of control over the story. So they pushed a different ending, death framed as honor. Roman moralists helped by praising women who died rather than live with shame, which made coercion easier to disguise. Here is the question worth asking before the next section. When a society praises noble suicide, how often was that a free decision, and how often was it a plan forced by relatives? Rome left clues, and they are ugly. Roman moralists praised women who swallowed poison or opened their veins to avoid capture or disgrace, and those stories shaped expectations. Add Augustus's adultery penalties, exile, property seizure, forced divorce, and lasting stigma, and you get a pressure cooker where death could be sold as the clean option. Think through the incentives inside a powerful household. A quiet death reduced courtroom attention, limited gossip, and protected property lines. A public scandal risked careers, marriage prospects, and political relationships. That trade-off pushed families to steer outcomes while still telling the public a story of choice. Ancient sources mention imperial women sent into exile or placed in situations where suicide became the expected exit. From outside the house, it looks voluntary. Inside, control over food, movement, and safety can make refusal dangerous. The label self-chosen can hide coercion. This matters because Rome treated pudicitia value as more important than survival. Once a woman's reputation got stamped as polluted, relatives could argue that death restored honor to everyone connected to her. If she refused, she could be blamed for dragging the whole family into deeper disgrace. Rome then recorded these deaths as moral examples.
That rewriting became its own weapon because it taught other women that silence and self-destruction counted as virtue. When public culture praises that outcome, private pressure becomes easier to apply. Sometimes the law did more than approve the vibe. The Lex Julia included a deadly clause for fathers under strict conditions, allowing a father who caught his daughter in adultery in his own house to kill her and the lover. That rule blurred the line between state justice and private violence. So here is the next question. What happens when a legal system hands punishment back to the family and steps aside? In Rome, that handoff could turn relatives into executioners, and the state treated it as discipline. The next section shows exactly how that worked. Under Lex Julia, a father who caught his daughter in adultery in his own house could kill her and her lover under strict conditions and avoid murder charges. Jurists debated details like timing and location. Yet the core message stayed clear. Family order mattered more than her future. That rule sent two signals. The state trusted the male head of household to act decisively, and a disgraced woman stopped counting as protected kin. Her death could be presented as moral restoration, which made family violence look like civic service. Ancient writers praised stern fathers who preserved discipline through harsh action. Praise matters because it rewards behavior. In an honor culture, a woman's disgrace could damage brothers' careers, harm sisters' marriage prospects, and stain every connected name. Fear of collective shame can push relatives to act fast. Even when families avoided outright killing, control could still be severe. Locking a woman away, stripping dowries, forcing divorce, and using violence inside the home could happen with little outside oversight. Few witnesses, few legal tools, and a culture that assumed male authority made resistance hard. So surviving a magistrate never guaranteed safety. A woman could face judgment twice, first in court, then at home, with the second arena hidden behind walls. That hidden arena also made voluntary suicide easier to stage, because family control can shape what the outside world sees. If she survived family punishment, another path waited at the bottom of the social ladder. Rome had sentences designed to keep people alive for labor, and those places often erased identity as thoroughly as death. That leads to the next ugly turn. Survival could mean mines, prison farms, or brothels, spaces where legal protection shrank and violence became routine. If you think prison equals punishment, Rome used something slower and often worse. Roman imprisonment worked differently than modern prison. The Mamertine cells in Rome mainly held people before execution or transfer, and accounts describe cramped underground spaces, darkness, poor air, and chains. For low-status women, the outcome after trial could be forced labor rather than release. One of the harshest sentences was damnatio ad metalla, condemnation to the mines. Legal studies connect this to branding and tattooing before transport. Conditions were brutal: long hours underground, chains, toxic dust, and frequent collapse. A slow destruction that many writers treat as close to execution by exhaustion. Women could also end up in ergastula, private prison farms where chained workers labored in pits or cramped cells. Others could be pushed into state-regulated brothels. Archaeology at Pompeii shows small, windowless rooms with stone beds, built for use, not comfort. That detail matters because it shows planning. These spaces were designed for repeated exploitation, not temporary shelter. These sentences erased normal life. No civic role, no legal marriage, and no reliable way to speak in court. The law cared mainly that the sentenced stayed alive long enough to produce work. There is a practical trap, too. Overcrowding, iron restraints, and dependence on guards or other prisoners for food created daily vulnerability, including sexual violence. Isolation from community support made abuse easier and escape almost impossible. When people died in these systems, families often could not retrieve bodies or hold proper rites, and Roman culture treated denial of burial as a heavy, final insult. That is where the story turns from punishment into erasure, because the body itself could be disposed of like waste. If you want to see how Rome finished the job, look at what happened after death, because the last cruelty often came when a name vanished from stone and memory. Roman elites built tombs and inscriptions along roads because names carved in stone kept status alive. By contrast, executed criminals, many slaves, and the poorest people often went into mass graves, roadside pits, or river dumps with no marker. Scholars note that denial of rights treated a person as social trash, removed from the city's memory. Legal categories mattered in death. People condemned to harsh punishments could become servi poene, slaves of punishment, with no right to property, family, or normal funeral rights. Their bodies belonged to the state as much as their labor did, so disposal could be quick and quiet. Studies of prisons and execution sites suggest bodies could move out through hidden passages and into carts headed toward dumping grounds, sometimes toward the Tiber. Archaeology around Roman cities supports the pattern: pits with mixed remains, few grave goods, and no inscriptions, more like disposal sites than family graves. For disgraced women who died as condemned laborers or enslaved prostitutes, this meant no stone, no name, and no formal place for relatives to mourn. In Roman culture, burial linked to memory and status, so losing it amounted to a final punishment layered on top of everything else. Epitaph collections add another clue. The record preserves more lines about crimes than about these women's deaths, which suggests the system kept the warning and discarded the person. That imbalance matters because it shapes what later generations know about them. A legal label survives, a life story disappears. So the chain ends in a place Rome preferred, a body without a name, easy to forget. If one accusation can start that chain, what stops a society from using morality as a weapon whenever it wants control? Hold that thought, because the same mechanisms show up again and again in how public shame